Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are bringing you our review of the OnePlus 5T. So what we're going to do, we'll dive into the specs before going into detail over the design, the display and so on. So my particular model of the 5T has a Snapdragon 835 processor that's paired with 8GB of RAM, and there's also 128GB of internal storage. However, that is not expandable as there's no option to insert a micro SD into the 5T. We also have a 6.01 inch 2160 by 1080 AMOLED display. There's a dual camera system round the back with a primary 16 megapixel camera, and then there's the secondary 20 megapixel camera. There's a 16 megapixel selfie camera around the front, a 3300 milliamp battery, and the 5T is now running Oreo 8.0, although it did launch with 7.1.1. So, starting with the design of the 5T, I think the most notable change, the most notable upgrade over the OnePlus 5 is the new aspect ratio of the display. It's now got the very modern, very trendy, ultra-thin bezels. It's only got a small forehead at the top, the small chin at the bottom, and that is because OnePlus has actually stretched the aspect ratio of the screen, so it's now got the 18:9 aspect ratio instead of the more standard 16:9 widescreen ratio. Essentially what this does is it makes the 6-inch screen look slightly thinner, slightly longer, but it really maximises the screen to body ratio, and the OnePlus 5T actually has an 80% screen to body ratio, which is very impressive. Now that front is protected by Corning Gorilla Glass 5, but the main body of the phone is actually aluminium. You can see I've got the black model, there are a few other colour options available, but the aluminium, it feels really nice. It's surprisingly fingerprint resistant, and combined with the curved corners of the phone as well as the tapered edges, it makes it really comfortable to hold in the hand. The aluminium is perhaps slightly slippery, so maybe I would suggest a case, but it's very ergonomic and very comfortable to hold. Moving over to the right hand side of the phone, here we find a power button as well as the SIM tray. The SIM tray can hold 2 nano SIMs, however, as I mentioned, there's no option to expand the storage with a micro SD card. Now, over on the left-hand side of the phone, we've got the classic OnePlus alert slider, which has a lovely textured bump to it. However, I did find, as this is a slider, when I'd pop it in and out of my jeans, I would occasionally knock the slider into a position I didn't want. So, for example, I'd pop it into my jeans on having it on the ringer mode, and it would turn it on to do not disturb, and I wouldn't find out until half an hour later, and maybe I missed a couple of calls, for instance. So that was just a minor annoyance, but it's really not the end of the world. And just below the slider, we've obviously got the volume rocker. Turning over to the bottom edge now, we can see there is actually a headphone jack, 3.5mm jack, so OnePlus should be commended for that. There's also the USB Type-C connector and a single downward firing speaker, which I found to be very average. It was very easy to cover up while gaming, for instance, and the sound really just wasn't that impressive. Turning over to the back of the phone, you've obviously got the dual cameras, one 16 megapixel, one 20 megapixel. There's the fingerprint scanner, as well as the small OnePlus logo. So on the whole, I think it's a well-designed phone. It's impressively light for the size, actually, because this one weighs in at 162 grams, when the Mate 10 Pro, for instance, is 178 grams, and the iPhone 8 Plus is actually 202 grams. So for a 6-inch display, I think OnePlus has done a good job getting this as light as it is. However, one notable omission is the lack of an IP water and dust resistance rating. I think you could probably get away with a few splashes as it's a fairly sealed design. However, there is no official IP rating, so that is one thing to bear in mind. Now, moving on to the display. As I mentioned, it's 6.01 inches and it uses an AMOLED panel. So for the money, I think this has to be the best screen on the market right now. It gets nice and bright, viewing angles for an AMOLED are actually really good, better than my Mate 10 Pro, for example. But most importantly, the colours really pop. You can even change the colour calibration in the settings if you want. There's a few different options to choose from, and you can even set a custom colour balance if you want. But on the whole, this has to be a really impressive display for the money. The blacks are nice and deep, really rich, whereas the colours really pop. And flicking between some different wallpapers that come preloaded on the phone, it looks really, really good. Some people might complain about the resolution as it's 2160 by 1080, as I mentioned, that 18:9 aspect ratio, and most competitors have Quad HD displays, so 1440p, and they are a bit sharper, but I think the OnePlus 5T actually has a pleasantly sharp display. It is 401 pixels per inch, So if you're looking very closely at the phone, you can just about spot the pixels, but holding it 30 centimeters away from your face, everything looks nice and sharp, and really I think this is sharp enough for the 6-inch display. Moving over to performance now, as I mentioned, this model has the Snapdragon 835 and I've got the 8GB RAM version. You can also get it with 6GB RAM, and that will only have 64GB storage as well, and that model I believe is £450. I've got the slightly more expensive one, which is $499, 128GB of internal storage, 8GB RAM. But the kicker really is the Snapdragon 835. We have just seen the new Galaxy S9 announced with the Snapdragon 845, but for now the 835 is really good. Performance of the 5T is flawless. Switching between open apps was lightning fast, not a hint of lag or latency, and opening new apps from cold is also very speedy. I also had no issues playing games with the 5T. For instance, I like to play a bit of Dune, nice little flick game there, and that is also ran like an absolute dream on the 5T. Another thing to mention is the fingerprint scanner, and this really is absolutely rapid. OnePlus reckons it's 0.2 seconds, and I'd say that's probably about right, if not even faster, because all I need to do, one quick tap of my finger on the scanner, and it's already on. It's really quick. And the same can actually be said for the Face ID. This is something new for the 5T, the face recognition. All I do, hold it up, and it's on. It's slightly slower than the fingerprint scanner. However, it is really reliable. I had essentially no issues while using it. And it also works in low light scenarios. For instance, I was lying in bed, I just had my bedside table lamp on, I could flick it on and it still works just fine. And I also found it work with or without my glasses, which is quite impressive. So fingerprint scanner and the facial recognition both work really well, and it's actually a really impressive aspect of the 5T. Another impressive aspect of the 5T has to be the software. When it launched, there were a few people complaining that the 5T only shipped with Android 7.1.1. However, my model's got the 8.0 update to Oreo, and I found it to be a very stock experience with just a few minor additions, which really helps improve the usability of the phone. For instance, you can customize things like the alert slider. One of my favorite options was also the ability to hide the navigation bar, which lets you make full use of the 6-inch display. And there are also a few gesture options to display with, for instance, swiping down on the fingerprint scanner to bring up your notifications. On the whole, it's a very clean stock experience. There's just a few helpful additions which I really like, but for those stock Android purists out there, I think the OnePlus 5T software is really going to appeal to you. It's bright, it's clean, it's colourful, and it's overall a pleasure to use. The next area I want to talk about is the camera, and I think this is probably the one area where we can see that the OnePlus 5T is a £500 phone rather than being an £800 phone, for instance. It's a dual camera setup with a 16 megapixel primary sensor, and there's this 20 megapixel secondary sensor as well, but both lenses have an f1.7 aperture. However, instead of having one wide angle and one telephoto lens, OnePlus has opted to dedicate the secondary lens to low light performance. It has this interesting feature where in low light situations it will merge 4 pixels into one, which should give enhanced detail and clarity. On the whole, I think the images are decent, but compared to other flagships, I can't help but feel the 5T's photos don't look as detailed, despite the fact it's a 16 megapixel sensor, while the dynamic range is also slightly lacking. Portrait mode is worth a mention, however. It's entirely software based and it does create a nice clean bokeh. However, edge detection can occasionally go a bit askew, but most of the time it works really well and I managed to take a few decent photos using that portrait mode. Low light performance is also okay, but again, I didn't look at my photos and think, yeah, that's the secondary camera, that's really improved that low light photo. So on the whole, the camera is okay, it's not the best. For £500, it's decent/average, but with the OnePlus 5T really targeting the high-end flagships, it is definitely one area where you can see it fall behind. Now, another thing to touch on is, of course, battery life. The OnePlus 5T has a 3300 mAh battery, and that hasn't actually been upgraded from the OnePlus 5 despite the increased resolution screen. However, it is a pretty standard size for a flagship, and really you do get pretty standard performance. I found it would last about a day off a full charge, and by 10 o'clock I was probably getting to around 15-20% battery left. If you do need to top up, you can use the included charger because that supports dash charge, which will give you a 60% boost in just 30 minutes. This is impressive to get you through the day. However, the battery life is not as good as the Mate 10 Pro, for instance. It's, I would say, decidedly average, not being better than the competition, not being worse. All in all, it's okay and it will get you through the day. So wrapping things up, for $499, I think the OnePlus 5T is a very appealing phone. You obviously get the very nice modern bezel-free design. The 6-inch display is also very, very good. I think it's probably the best for the money out there right now. And then the Snapdragon 835 is a top-class CPU. However, there are a few minor issues with the phone. For instance, the camera is probably the main one. It can't match its more expensive rivals there. Having non-expandable storage could be an issue for some, especially if you go for the 64GB model. And the mediocre single speaker is also a bit of a letdown. On the whole, however, I think the OnePlus 5T is a really good phone for the price. It's really going to target those people who want a no-nonsense, no-frills phone that just performs and performs very, very fast. However, if you are the kind of person who wants a bit more razzle-dazzle, a few more extra features, the OnePlus 5 doesn't necessarily have those. So you could be looking at a more expensive competitor if that's you. So I'm Dominic for Kit Guru. This has been our review of the OnePlus 5T. If you like this video, hit thumbs up. If you didn't, you can hit thumbs down and leave us a comment to let us know why. We'd also love you to subscribe to keep an eye on future videos coming from us, and also connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to chat with you guys over there. So I'm Dominic with Kit Guru. This has been our review of the OnePlus 5T, and we will see you in the next video.